Chapter 15 of Finn the Wolfhound by Alec John Dawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Making of a Wild Beast. The transformation begun in Finn by the night he had spent in a rocking train, caged between a tiger and two bears, was enormously accentuated and confirmed by his encounter with the Professor. If zoologists had deliberately set themselves the task of converting an Irish Wolfhound into a wild beast, they could hardly have taken any more effective measures than those which had been adopted by pure chance with Finn, from the time at which he reached Sam's hands; and it is probable that no zoologist with any humanity in him would have made progress so extraordinarily rapid. The mere fact of being caged behind iron bars for the first time in his life, and that between a roaring, snarling tiger and two grunting little bears, strongly odoriferous of the wild, affected Finn in somewhat the same manner that a highly excitable and nervous man of quite untrained intellect might be affected by being flung into a cell surrounded by raving maniacs. If such a man, after a dozen hours in his cell, were approached by some one whom he had every reason to regard as a friend and a rescuer, and beaten cruelly with a weapon possessed of strange and altogether horrible qualities, supernatural qualities so far as he could tell, it is fair to suppose that he would be as much transformed by the ordeal as Finn was by his ordeal. Shortly after the episode of the red-hot iron, Finn's cage was again visited by Sam and the Professor, the former being laden with a big, blood-stained basket. From this basket the Professor took a large chunk of raw flesh and pushed it through the bars into Finn's cage. A bone was also thrust through the bars, and a fixed iron pan near the gate was filled from outside with water. The Professor eyed Finn curiously while he performed these operations, and was surprised that the giant wolf, as they called him, did not spring forward upon the food. "I've put the fear of God into him all right, Sam," said the Professor. "He's not going to touch his grub while we're here. Like all wolves, he's mighty frightened of traps, and I guess he reckons there's a trap attached to this meat. Watch how Killer tackles his." Killer was already ravening furiously at the bars of his cage, his yellow eyes ablaze as he watched the meat his soul desired being thrust into Finn's cage. The tiger's roars kept Finn's hackles up, and his fangs bared in a fierce snarl, so that the Professor was struck afresh with the savageness of the latest addition to the menagerie under his care. Killer's meat barely reached the floor of his cage before he had snatched and carried it to the rear, where he tore it savagely, while maintaining an incessant growling snarl. But he dropped the meat as though it burned, and crouched fearfully in the opposite corner of his den when, by way of display for Sam's benefit, the Professor picked up his iron bar and threatened the tiger with it. Now Finn, on the other hand, when he saw the cruel bar raised, sprang forward with a growling roar of defiance, 4 feet outstretched, bristling back curved for the leap, and white fangs flashing. "Too sulky to eat it, but mighty concerned when he thought I was going to take his meat from him," commented the Professor in explanation to Sam. As a matter of fact, Finn had not thought of the meat. His present feeling was that he had fallen among a lot of mad wild beasts, some of whom, by curious chance, had the appearance of menfolk. If one among them should lift an iron bar, and more especially if the maddest and most hated among them, the Professor, should lift the bar, why then, as Finn saw it, his one chance for life was to fight, to strike hard and swiftly. "We'll have to keep these two always caged together," said the Professor, with a careless glance at Finn and the tiger. "Old Killer works him up in great style. I guess he'll fetch the public all the time, while he can hear old Killer at his antics. He certainly is the finest-looking beast I ever saw in the wolf line, and he's as strong and heavy as a horse. I guess your number would have been up for sure, Sam, if you'd been in my shoes a while back, when he got me down. What I don't like about the beggar is you can't reckon on him. He don't seem to have the same ways as most of 'em. He don't fly at you right away. He doesn't even jump for his grub, you see. He seems to lie back and consider. It's a bad thing, that, for he's hefty enough anyway, without stopping to think about his wickedness like a man. He's going to be a rough, hard case to tame, Sam, that giant wolf of yours, but he's come to a hard case tamer, too, and don't you forget it. He's got to bend or break, and you can gamble clear down to the butt of your sack on that, my son. Come on now, and I'll show you how the others are fed. Just fill the old killer's water dish first." It was now 30 hours since Finn had tasted food, and 3 days since he had eaten a proper meal. If his experience of the past 24 hours had been in every other respect distressing, they had at least robbed him of grief about the master. His outraged physical senses, and the tremendous strain placed upon his nervous system, effectually shut grief out from his mind. Finn was accustomed to have meals served to him in spotless enamelled dishes, and it had always been food of which a man might have partaken: well-cooked meats, bread, vegetables, and gravy, nicely cut and mixed. Now, for a long time, the condition of passionate protest and irritability produced in him by all that he had gone through, and by Killer's continuous growling, prevented his touching the meat which lay near the bars of his cage. But hunger triumphed after a while, and with a quick, rather furtive movement, but with lips drawn back and every sign exposed of readiness to defend his action, Finn lifted the big chunk of meat from its place by the bars and carried it into a corner at the back of the cage, where he tore it into fragments and ate it, of necessity, very much as a wolf eats, the blood of the raw meat trickling meanwhile about his jaws. To drink, Finn had to place his head close to those bars, which most nearly adjoined the front of the tiger's cage. But drink was necessary to him now, and so, with his nose all furrowed, his fangs bared, and a formidable low snarl issuing from his throat, he slowly approached the water-pan and lapped his fill, pausing to snarl aloud at the tiger between each 3 or 4 laps of his tongue. But Killer had fed full and crunched his bone to splinters and eaten that, so now he was preparing himself to sleep. If Finn could have followed Killer's example and slept, it would have helped him immensely, for his overwrought system needed rest more badly than anything else just then. But this was impossible, as yet, for the sensitive Wolfhound. The 2 bears in the next cage were playing together furiously, and the tiger's breathing, while he slept, was a maddening kind of cross between a purr and a snore. Maddening, that is, to one who found the creature's mere proximity incredibly distasteful. This hatred of the Killer's neighbourhood was no whim, no personal fastidiousness on Finn's part. It went much deeper than that. For example, so far the hair on Finn's back would not assume its natural position. It still stood half erect, and harsh and stiff as fine wire, by which the tension of his nerves may be imagined. No, Finn could not sleep. The hours of the day dragged slowly by, and Finn began to suffer in new ways. He had never been confined for any length of time before, and strict cleanliness was an instinct with him. At length, as the hot afternoon drew to its close, a number of men came to the cages, and horses were hitched on to the heavy wagon which supported them, at a level of less than 3 feet from the ground. Killer woke with a start, and with his tail angrily flogged the partition which divided him from Finn, while delivering himself of a snarling yawn. Finn leapt to his feet, answering the tiger's snarl viciously, himself looking to the full as savage as any of the wild kindred. The wagon moved with a jerk. Killer rolled against his side of the partition and growled ferociously. Finn sprang at the partition as though he thought his great weight would carry him through it, and his jaws snapped at the air as he sprang. The men roared with laughter at him, and this accentuated his feelings that they were all mad wild beasts together. Presently Finn's cage, with others, was ranged along the side of a canvas-covered passage-way by which the public were to approach the main tent, where that night's performance was to be given. This double row of cages was arranged here with a view to impressing the public, a kind of foretaste of the glories they were to behold within. The Southern Cross circus had patent turnstiles fixed at both ends of the main tent, those at one end admitting only of ingress, those at the other end admitting only of egress. It was shortly after this that Finn became conscious of a curious grinding small sound at the back of his cage. Presently a sharp, bright point of steel entered the cage from behind, just above the level of Finn's head, as he sat on his haunches. The steel wormed its way into the cage to a length of fully 6 inches, and then it reached the side of Killer's cage, pointing diagonally, and bored slowly through that. The auger was well greased, and made only a very slight sound, so slight, indeed, that Killer was not aware of it. He was not so highly strung as Finn at this time. This auger hole was an idea of Sam's, for which he hoped to derive credit from the boss. He had noted carefully the remark of the Professor about keeping the giant wolf close to the tiger, in order to lend additional fierceness to his demeanour. And so, with the thoughtlessly cruel cunning of a schoolboy, he had devised a means of improving upon this. He took a thin iron rod, and covered the end of it with soft, porous sacking, which he moistened with the blood of raw meat. Then, by thrusting this between the bars of Finn's cage, and jabbing violently at the Wolfhound with it for several minutes, he endeavoured to impregnate the sacking on the rod with a smell of Finn. Then he invited John L. Rutherford to take up a stand in front of the cages, as though he were a member of the general public, and to whistle by way of signalling that he was ready. Directly Sam heard the whistle, he being now behind the cages, he thrust his sacking-covered rod through the auger hole he had made from Finn's cage into the tiger's, and there rattled it to and fro to attract the Killer's attention. Killer not only heard and saw the intruding object, but smelt it, and sprang at it violently, with a rasping, savage snarl which challenged the giant wolf to come forward, or be forever accursed for a coward. The rod was withdrawn on the instant, and Finn's whole great bulk crashed against the partition, as he answered Killer with a roar of defiance. The great Wolfhound stood erect on his hind feet, snapping at the air with foaming jaws, and tearing impotently at the iron-sheathed partition with his powerful claws. The boss applauded vigorously, and gave Sam a shilling for beer. "You keep that up while the people are coming in, Sam, and by gosh we'll have 'em in fits. The giant's a sure star performer every time. He's worth 2 or 3 of the Killer, when he prances round on his tail that way. It was quite a bright notion of yours, Sam, that auger hole." It must have been nearly 2 hours later, when the public was being admitted in a regular stream to the big tent, and Sam had succeeded in working the tiger and the Wolfhound into a perfect frenzy of impotent rage, of snarling, foaming, roaring fury, that a faint odour crossed Finn's nostril, and a faint sound fell upon his ears, through all the din and tumult of the conflict with his unseen enemy. In that moment, and as though he had been shot, Finn dropped from his erect position and bounded to the front bars of his cage with a sudden, appealing whine, very unlike the formidable cries with which he had been rending the pent air of his prison for the past quarter of an hour. He had heard a few words spoken in a woman's voice, and those words were, "I cannot bear to look at them. I never do. Let us hurry straight in." In a passion of anxiety, and grief, and love, and remorse for not having been on the look-out, Finn poured out his very soul in a succession of long-drawn whines, plaintive and insistent as a 'cello's wailing, while his powerful forepaws tugged and scratched ineffectually at the solid iron bars of his cage. The woman whose voice he heard was the mistress of the kennels, and the man to whom she spoke, who walked beside her, looking obstinately at her and not at the cages, was the Master. Something seemed to crack in poor Finn's breast as the two humans whom he loved disappeared from his view within the great tent. He did not know that they would not pass that way again, because the audience left the place by the opposite end of the tent. But he gave no thought to the future. Here, in the midst of his uttermost misery and humiliation, the Master, the light of his light, had passed within a few feet of him, and passed without a glance, without a word. For long Finn gazed miserably out between the bars, sniffing hopelessly at the air through which his friends had passed. Then slowly he retired to the furthermost corner of his cage, and curled down there, with his muzzle between his paws, and great drops of bitter sadness trickling out from beneath his overhanging brows. And not all the ferocity of Killer, nor all the ingenuity of Sam with his sacking-covered rod, availed to draw Finn from his corner again that night. It seemed as though his heart had cracked, and every other emotion than grief trickled out from it in the form of tears. It was the saddest moment of Finn's life till then, and it was a bitter kind of sadness too. Not one little look, not one glance for Finn in the midst of his torment. End of chapter 15.